Yeah, I'm curious to start with you. If you can kind of look back, um, growing up as a kid, what was kind of like your first exposure to music, and what kind of made you want to kind of pick up bass and start playing
It's a
that?
great question.
Yeah.
Perfect question. Growing up, I was born in 1966 in a hospital in Detroit. I was raised in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan. My father worked for Ford Motor Company. My mother was a housewife, but she was very musically inclined. She played piano. Some of my earliest memories are my mother and grandmother playing ragtime piano because there was a movie that came out in the 70s called The Sting that kind of brought back ragtime piano. Um, and I also remember being in elementary school, going to the DIA for a field trip, and we saw these puppets miming to the Supremes and Motown songs. And I remember kind of the melodies of Motown songs like Stop in the Name of Love or I'll Be There by the Temptations. All that stuff melodically really resonated with me. And I think one of the great things about growing up in Detroit, especially in the 70s and the early 80s, was the radio was incredible.
Yeah.
You had all the FM stations were playing everything from David Bowie to, Zeppelin, The Doors, and everything in between. Joe Jackson, a new wave guy from England, was being played in the same sets as the band Yes. And also the amount of concerts and all the stuff going on when the radio started to get more interesting, like listening to the electrifying Mojo on, at that point, it was WGPR. And he was an overnight radio host of what was essentially an urban radio station that he would play everything from Jay Giles Band to Kraftwerk to
Oh yeah.
Cybertron, which was a techno group that was from Detroit.
Yeah.
And so, you heard a lot of Prince, you heard a lot of Michael Jackson. So, I think I always just really loved music. I was a huge connoisseur of music. I had a subscription to Rolling Stone magazine when I was like in seventh grade. I
Yeah.
thought I was the biggest badass, you know,
Yeah.
and that's where it started. And the irony was, I had always wanted to be in a band or whatever. I'd taken a little bit of drum lessons when I was a little kid, but they were really technical drum lessons, like wham tap, totally turned me off to playing drums.
Okay.
And then a fancy thing happened. My my senior year of school, I was expelled from high school. Whoops. And we had a ski trip to Canada, and me and another guy had the idea to get $20 American from everybody and take it to the brewer's retail, which in Canada you can only buy beer from one store. It's government. It's a government store. Anyway, we got caught and we were expelled for this. And during my downtime, because I was a straight A student at Grosse Pointe South High School, I bought a bass guitar from
Okay.
a place called Fiddler's Music up on Mac. Your dad will remember it. It was a music place. It also had a recording studio. I believe it was called Mac Avenue Recording. And it was a little Gibson SG copy bass. I remember it had the Bacardi. Bacardi is a kind of rum, but it had Bacardi, the little bats that are the Bacardi logo on the pickups. So it actually didn't sound great. But I just started playing bass. And I remember going down to Indian Village to the house of a guy named Kevin Monroe, who would wind up being in the Laughing Hyenas and wind up being in Mule and would wind up being the band that I kind of learned to play bass from and then learned to play bass with because Majesty Crush used to play with them. But in high school, I used to screw around on the bass, little stuff like that. And I always had a taste for underground music. I was going to punk shows, like going to see Black Flag, the Bad Brains, a lot of new wave shows too, Psychedelic Furs, Echo and the Bunnymen. I probably saw Psychedelic
Oh yeah.
Furs 8 times while I was in high school. So all that just kind of snowballed. In college, I was a music journalist, and I was a big fan of a band called Spahn Ranch. It was this kind of crazy trio. There was a guy drumming on his knees named Odell Nails. There was a
Yeah.
guitar player named Brad who did everything at a weird tuning and played with his mouth open. And then there was a singer who sounded like if Perry Farrell from Jane's Addiction was in a boys choir. He was incredible, his range. And it was this a Motor Booty magazine, which was kind of a very sarcastic magazine published out of Ann Arbor during that time, called Spahn Ranch, New Age Music for People with Black Leather Jackets. I was a super fan of that band.
Yeah.
And in my junior year of college, they invited me to play with them.
Yeah.
And I started to play bass with them. And that's where I started to be in a band. That's when I started playing music.
Yeah. So, you're at U of M, and then, you said your junior year, you joined Spahn Ranch. Was Odell, he's the drummer at the time, was he?
He's the drummer. Yep.
Yeah.
He's on his knees with this ingenious drum kit. He coined the great phrase, back to the wood. Spahn Ranch was wonderfully unconventional. The songs were simple. They were perfect.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have a bass player. They didn't have it wasn't a conventional band at all.
Yeah.
And whenever it would sound too busy or too whatever, because I couldn't really play bass. That's what made me perfect. I played bass like a rhythm guitar.
Yeah.
Odell always used to say, we got to get back to the wood, back to the simplicity. Because when the band started, Spahn Ranch, he was just playing like little wooden percussion things. And it sounds very naive and a little bit affected, but that was kind of always our thing. And then Spahn Ranch, they had made a record. They had done some shows on the West Coast. I joined. My first show with them was opening up for Sonic Youth in Pontiac at a club called Industry. I don't think it was called that then. My senior year, the fall of my senior year of college. And we did some shows out of state. We played with a band called Savage Republic, which your dad would know. They were kind of like the Sonic Youth of the West Coast.
Okay.
We did some shows on the East Coast. And then that band kind of disbanded. And then the next thing I know, it's 1990. And Odell is now living with David Straughter. Now, David Straughter lived with me when I was in college. He was just a guy who was really cool. He was going to community college. And we actually invited him to sing on a Spahn Ranch song. We had a song that we were screwing around with a keyboard and drum machines at a studio called The Disc on 9 Mile. And Mike E. Clark, the guy who used to do all the music for Insane Clown Posse, he's worked with Kid Rock, he's worked with everybody. He was a great friend of Bob, our singer, and he looped this track, and we invited Dave to sing on it. It was like it was almost like a New Order type song, right?
Yeah.
It had drum machines. We called it Acid House. And Dave's lyrics were, "What would you do if 2 lions attacked me, tearing me up with their claws?" And it was just blew us away. I'm getting chills remembering it. I remember him singing it because it was just so inventive and so like bizarre. That was the first thing out of his mouth. So that was his first recording with us. We didn't think anything of it. I don't even know if that song exists. Mike Clark has it. And then basically what happened was, with that seed, then 1990 comes around. Dave and Odell are living together, and they're like, we want to form a band. And I'm like, I want in. And I kind of almost had to like audition for it and like be down. And they had this townhouse in Indian Village in Detroit. And I remember going in the basement just with a little practice amp. I had this little bass left over. It was like a hollow body that I'd bought from a pawn shop in Ypsilanti, like a Beatle bass. And we didn't have a guitar player. And the issue was they had a very good friend, and I knew him, I loved him, his name is Dumini DePoris. You may know of him. He's one of the best guitar players in Detroit, and certainly one of the best in the country. He's played with George Clinton. He's played with HR from Bad Brains. He is a tour de force. He was also probably too good. And the irony was, we had this opportunity to have this band with a guy who was a top-notch musician, like he is today a studio professional musician. But we decided back to the wood, we needed something a little simpler, something that maybe wasn't going to be as identifiable, and there was this guy, Michael Siegel, who Dave and I had known. We had lived in Hamtramck after college. Michael worked at a record store called Play It Again Records. And Dave would come back from Play It Again Records with these records that Michael would turn him on to. And I remember Dave was a big fan of a group called X-Mile Deutschland, because Dave was German. And they were kind of a smaller band on the 4AD label, which was kind of the ethereal label, Cocteau Twins and all that stuff.
Yep.
But then he brings home this record called 69 by a group called A.R. Kane.
Yep, I'm familiar.
And we put that on, and it was like, what is this? This is like dub reggae, Jesus and Mary Chain, with like pop vocals. It sounds like Motown in a dub remix, like Cocteau Twin. We were blown away by that record. Yeah. And in the winter of 1989, when Dave and I were living together with my girlfriend in Hamtramck, we just listened to that record over and over and over again. Well, cut to 1990 when we're starting the band, and we're like, wow, this is kind of where we want to go. This is this music, the world is capable of having this kind of music in it, which is a guy who can really sing over music that's ethereal, but it's very inventive and interesting sounding. And it's not conventional sounding. It doesn't sound like anything else. Yeah. And, of course, the guys in the band were black, and there weren't a lot of bands from England doing ethereal music that were black. And Dave and Odell were like, we kind of saw like, hey, this might bring some possibilities. Yeah. So that 1990, the guy who sold us that record, Michael, we invited him to come be in our band. And he had a guitar. It had 3 strings. One of them was tuned to D flat, and the other 2 strings were tuned to A. And we must have written 5 songs with that 3-string guitar. We would just jam. We wrote Cicciolina on that guitar. That's that was like one of our first singles. It's the B-side to the Sunny Pie single. Yep. And we were a band. We were suddenly a band. Now, Michael working at a record store gave us a certain credibility and visibility. And that's how we were able to get gigs like at the record store. And Odell and I knew a lot of people from Spahn Ranch. And so suddenly we were getting asked to play with groups like Mazzy Star, for instance. That was like our first gig. I was on my birthday in 1990. We opened up for Mazzy Star. We probably had 5 songs, and we played 5 songs. But that's the whole genesis of that band. It was, we were fans of Michael. Dave was our friend. Suddenly it's Dave and Odell forming a band. And the next thing you know, the guy who's selling us records is our guitar player.
Yeah. It's interesting because, about the A.R. Kane thing, Michael, he definitely brings kind of that shoegaze element to the band with his guitar work. And I can definitely feel like he was inspired by like A.R. Kane and kind of like the early like shoegaze acts. And he kind of brought that shoegaze element to the band, which I think is really cool. It makes sense. That's kind of, I guess, what he was listening to at the time.
Well, Michael we had these cassettes, right? So Michael would have access to records from Play It Again Records that nobody else had. Yeah. And so there was a group called Loop from England. Now they're really interesting. They're very repetitive and kind of psychedelic, but they're really heavy. But they had this song. It was a live record. It was a 12-inch called Prisma Uber Europa. and you can find this, there's 3 versions of it. It has a bass line that the second you hear it, you will be like, oh, that's where Hobey gets a lot of his bass ideas. It's
Okay.
this beautiful little bass melody, and then it's just a 2-chord jam for 12 to 15 minutes. We used to joke because everybody lived like 15 minutes apart. You could put that cassette in, drive wherever you needed to go, from my house to Dave's house, from Dave's house to Play It Again Records, to Michael's house, and you would listen to that song. It was that long.
Yeah.
He dubbed us all cassettes of that. And this is how we discovered the band. They weren't called The Verve. They were just Verve.
Yeah.
And they'd put out all these kind of psychedelic little singles. They had a song called Man Called Sun. They had a song called Gravity Grave. They had a song called Blue. And they were these big, sprawling, kind of melodic. The only way I can describe it is imagine like, I don't know, like The Cure, kind of more as a soul band. I mean, that's a terrible, terrible way to describe it.
Okay.
But they put out this live record called Voyager 1.
Yep, I took a listen
And the
recently.
first song on it is a song called Slide Away. Now, that's the first song on the Verve's classic album, A Storm in Heaven.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. A Storm in Heaven is a very studio album.
Yeah,
They're
for
playing
sure.
softer. They're playing with more effects. They're trying to make a headphone record.
Mm-hmm.
The Voyager 1 version of Verve is like a rock band in all its glory. Put it this way. They toured England with the Black Crowes and people loved them because they thought they were like seeing Pink Floyd. Okay. Yeah. So we had these cassettes that Michael would make us, and we would just obsessively listen to these records, you know, all the early Slow Dive stuff, Golden Hair, their Pink Floyd cover or their Sid Barrett cover. Michael just infused us. So we were all listening to a lot of the same things.
Yeah.
When Galaxy 500 put out their cover of Ceremony by New Order, Joy Division, I was obsessed with that one. That was another one. Michael got us that, right? So we're all listening to music Dave and I and Odell are getting from Michael, these kind of exclusive record store things. And so that's what's fueling our sense of what we're listening to and what we're aspiring to.
Yep.
And you can hear the influence of all that stuff. I mean, at the same time, too, there was a lot of hip hop. Like I was really into a group called EPMD. I love the way their songs were the parts were very sort of subtle and overlapping. They were kind of an East Coast group that sort of sounded like a West Coast group as far as hip hop. And we loved the idea of the repetition. We all loved Public Enemy. We were huge fans of Public Enemy, just the way the music was more about different elements, kind of making a larger whole than parts and stuff. We weren't into like stuff that was super riffy or super, you know, kind of identifiable as, oh, that is a rock song or that is a, you know, whatever. I mean, you know, I play bass like it's a guitar. Michael played guitar more like it was sound. He didn't really play riffs. Odell's drumming was very melodic, and Dave would kind of sing these deeply personal, kind of erotic fantasy, kind of obsessive lyrics. So, you know, the way it all came together was we were listening to the best of all this underground music. I mean, I remember in college, Dave was the one that turned me on to Sid Barrett. I didn't know that much about Deep Pink Floyd. He dubbed me all the cassettes of, you know, Madcap Laughs and all the early Sid Barrett, you know, his solo work, which is insanely good, literally and figuratively. And that was always a massive influence on Dave, you know, was Pink Floyd and the whole aesthetic of Pink Floyd. And so you had these elements coming together, but we were focused because we all like loved the same bands and we all loved the same records. We all had our individual tastes, but Michael, you know, in the record store was keeping us like right on top of stuff.
I'd like to ask just quickly about the fan EP, kind of how the creative process, you know, led you to those 5 songs. I know Sunny Pie made it on there. That was one of the first songs you guys did. and I think the song "Worry." It didn't make it to the re-release, but I think it's actually a really good track. It's really underrated.
It will. It will. That
Okay.
just to note this, the fan EP that Numero has re-released is kind of that in spirit only. They're
Okay.
deliberately not releasing the tracks individually. They're releasing them collectively.
Yeah.
So the original fan EP was us. We had recorded a record. We'd recorded Sunny Pie and Cicciolina.
Yeah.
We recorded it with Mike Clark. I think we recorded it the disc, or maybe the Temper Mill by then, or it might have even been his house. But we had these two songs. And Sunny Pie was the first thing that we came up with where Michael had a real 6-string guitar. He'd actually bought a Telecaster.
Hmm.
And that he came up with that little dun, dun, dun riff. And then I
Yeah.
had my little, my bass. I'd say more than half of my bass lines were an E or an A note on the D string, and then it would go up to B, C sharp. It was some combination of that. Feign
Yeah.
Sleep is that.
Yeah.
They're all the same song, just because that's the way I played. I wasn't a great bass player, but I knew what I liked. So we have Sunny Pie and we have Cicciolina, and we put it out as a single, and it was a single. It's what people did back then. We sold it. We still have copies of it, but it was a first effort. And then Dave was always very, 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 very supported by his parents. They were the greatest. Ted and Inga Straughter were fantastic. They knew their son was an artist. They believed in him. They invested in him. So they basically loaned us the money to go into the Temper Mill and make a proper record. So we had Sunny Pie. We already had that. We had this song, Worry, which was kind of a little riff. And again, it's a riff in A and B. It's very similar to our other songs, but it's Dave taking on a little bit. It's a softer song. It'd be
Yeah, for
closer
sure.
to, say, the Cowboy Junkies or something. And then we have a version of Penny for Love on that record. And Penny for Love is interesting because Dave lived in Indian Village, and in his neighborhood, a lady was robbed at gunpoint coming out of her car. And Dave was actually picked up in a sweep of potential suspects and spent a weekend in jail.
Yeah.
Because he looked like this guy that he wound up being innocent, but just through some whatever, he wound up spending time in jail. And he got out of jail. In our first practice, we wrote Penny for Love.
Yep. Yeah.
A lot of people would come out of jail, especially after being there under false pretenses, and write a very angry song. Dave wrote Penny for Love, which is essentially about being a prostitute to afford to be in love with another prostitute. I mean, and that's a horrible way to describe it. That's why Dave's the poet, I'm the critic. But
Yeah.
there you go. And so the songs on that were what? They were Penny for Love, they were Worry, they were Sunny Pie. And what else is on that record? The
Number
fan
one
EP.
fan and Horse.
Okay, so these are really important. So Number One Fan was written, I lived at 1 John R., which is now 1500 Woodward. I lived in the top floor of that. And we had a rehearsal space in the basement at this point. It was actually in the, it's called the Wright K building. It was a jewelry business. And there was a diamond vault in the basement. And we had our band gear set up in the diamond vault. And we came up with Number One Fan in that basement. Number One Fan started off as me very poorly trying to play the progression of Ain't No Mountain High Enough. that Ain't No Mountain High Enough.
Yeah. Yep.
Doon, 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 doon.
Yeah.
But
I can hear
I
it.
made that Brit pop. I went ding, 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 ding. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we
Oh,
had
that's
that
great.
song. And then Horse is really heavy because Horse was written about a friend who was going through addiction. And Horse is this kind of perfect song about, there's a, what is it? There's a something at the door. He's come for a little more than just one look. It's about death,
Yeah.
about fate. It's about this person is getting drawn into death by fate. And the line is, he just love if you got in his carriage. And then the song, kind of like we do this again when we do the song, Boyfriend, but it has a fast rush part. And that's supposed to be like you're on this drug and this drug is taking you somewhere, and then it crashes. And so what was ironic was we'd written Sunny Pie, which is a pop song. Penny for Love was like a total pop song. I mean, you know, I've told you the bass line, the dynamic of it, it was kind of like inspired by Smells Like Teen Spirit, just something very straightforward that really doesn't change. It just gets louder and different.
Yeah.
And then we have Worry, which is kind of what I would call a B-side. It's a simple song. It's kind of like our version of Waiting on a Friend. It's kind of an atypical song, kind of a little more of a, you know, it's got kind of more of a, it's not a really in your face song. It's more of a ditty. And
No,
then Horse is Heavyweight, and Number One Fan is this obsessive song about Jodie Foster, about the guy, David Hinckley, or is it Mark? What's his name? The guy who was obsessed with Jodie Foster, so he tried to kill Ronald Reagan. That's what the song is about. It's about being so obsessed with somebody that you're willing to kill the president. And that's the whole line of that.
Yeah, no, the song Worry is actually really pretty.
Here we are trying to make a,
yeah, no, I was
it's
just gonna,
pretty, but it's also got a little, I mean, obviously it's a song about worrying.
yeah,
You know, it's a pretty song. It's really an unpleasant topic.
yeah,
Horse is about addiction. Number One Fan is about being so obsessed with somebody you're willing to kill the president.
yeah,
You know, Penny for Love is a pop ditty about being a prostitute to afford a prostitute. You know, and Sunny Pie is about being obsessed with a lady who works at an X-rated bookstore.
yeah,
Who dresses you up in lingerie. So, I mean, you know, I'm describing this now very matter-of-factly,
yeah,
but can you imagine in 1990 Detroit, against a backdrop of a million bands trying to sound like Nirvana and the Chili Peppers, and Soundgarden and all those other bands getting huge, there's this little band with a black singer who's coming up with songs, and we have 5 songs that are about what I just described. And we decide we're going to put that out on CD. You know what I mean?
yeah.
I mean, it was kind of hilarious, you know, but we put it out and it got radio play. You know, it got added to 89X, which was the big radio station. DET played it. We actually had a song on the radio.
Yeah, I heard that was, you know, doing some research that number one fan specifically got a lot of radio play around Detroit, but also in Windsor and like kind of Canada.
Yeah, because it was on that station.
Yeah.
And we were, you know, that was one of the great things about Detroit is Detroit's alternative radio station was actually a Canadian radio station.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were, you know, we had done shows in Windsor. We had a little, you know, I guess you could call it a fan base. Remember, this is pre-internet. This is pre-everything.
Yeah.
Everything is word of mouth.
Yep.
You're buying stuff because you read about it in a music magazine and you see the record at a record shop and you trust the people that work at the record shop to turn you on to it. Now, we had the blessing of the best record store in Detroit, the best one for this kind of music, Play It Again Records, Alan Covan, and he was a huge supporter. We also had the support of Amir Deza at St. Andrews Hall in Industry and Clutch, what was called Clutch Cargo, because he loved that we were different sounding. So every band that came to town, like these are names like Jesus Jones, Chapter House, the Soup Dragons, all these one-hit wonders that were coming from England, we would be the band that was chosen to open up for them because we didn't sound like every other band in Detroit. And yet we had pop songs, you know? I mean, you look back on it now, you realize what Dave was singing about was closer to something that maybe The Weeknd would come up with or Prince. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, it's the same subject matter as Prince and The Weeknd. It's all about kind of love and addiction and, you know, being in tune with the feminine and all that kind of stuff. We didn't think like that. But I now realize a lot of the appeal of Majesty Crush was we were a band that appealed, for lack of a better word, I think a lot of women enjoyed the music and could get into it. It wasn't like so rock. It was just like dudes. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It wasn't about big riffs and stuff. It was more about, melodies and singing along and stuff. So the fan EP we put out ourselves, it was for sale in whatever record stores we could get it into. And it gets on the radio, and suddenly we're being invited to play like in East Lansing, or we're going to Chicago to play, because now record stores and other bands are aware of us, and we're playing gigs with, say, Catherine, the band
Yep.
from Chicago where the drummer is married to, guess what, the bass player in Smashing Pumpkins.
Hmm.
So next thing you know, we're playing shows and there's members of the Pumpkins in the audience, and we're like, wow, you know
Yep.
and that was our first kind of thing. Fan was kind of our ticket to, hey man, this band's got it together enough to put out an EP, and it's getting on the radio.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the big deal.
Yeah, for sure. So it looks we got like 20 minutes left. I want to touch on Left 15. So after the Fan EP comes out on cassette, it said 1992, and
Yeah.
then 1993 is when Love 15 comes out. So how was like the creative process with recording new songs? I know some songs for the Fan EP made it onto the record, and then some
Yeah.
new songs were added.
It's a great question. So what happened was we started to get interest. We were on the cover of Alternative Press magazine with 3 other bands like Tsunami, Velocity Girl, and I'm blanking on the last one, but it was like, hey, these are the 4 American bands that are doing this kind of Brit sounding stuff, but they're really good.
Yeah.
And of course, we're kind of these moody poets from Detroit. Every other band was a little bit faster, brighter, and better, but we had this kind of vibe, for lack of a better word. Now, remember, our early shows are with bands like Laughing Hyenas, Wig, like Mule. We're playing with much heavier bands. We're just more, I don't know, I guess it'd be the equivalent of how, the Sunset Strip rock scene listened to like Lenny Kravitz in their downtime. We were kind of like adopted by a lot of heavy bands, even though we were kind of more of a poppy band, a dark pop band, but a pop band. So a label out of New York called Dolly Chameleon becomes interested in us. And we go play at the CMJ conference, which is the college music journalist thing in New York. And we get kind of wined and dined, and we get a record contract. And they're like, we want to do a record with you. And we're like, wow, this is great. So something that happens, it's funny, when you're used to doing your own stuff, you're used to doing it late at night when the studio time is cheaper and nobody has day jobs, or everybody has day jobs. And you're used to doing it like the way you're used to doing it. Like if you want to record your bass with an effect on it, you just plug the effect right in. Well, here's where it gets funny. So we decide to go with a studio in downtown Detroit called the White Room, which is a classic studio. It's literally like the Doobie Brothers. The board, the 24-track board or 48-channel board, is the Doobie Brothers board. They specialize in vintage audio equipment. And they see us, it was 2 brothers, friends of mine. I knew them from high school. My brother knew them really well, Andy Nera and Mike Nera. And they were fantastic musicians. They had a group from Detroit called Second Self, but they were really making a name for themselves with this studio. So, their whole thing was, you can make a record that'll make you sound like a band that got really big in 1992 or 3, or you can make a record where your sounds, what you're capable of, are more like classic rock, like forever sounding. And at first we were moody poets about it, but I saw their point. And we went into the White Room. And the irony was, I lived across the street from the White Room. I lived at 1 John R, right, literally across the street. It's in Capitol Park.
Okay.
So I would walk over and we would record like starting at 10 in the morning. Now that's a little weird when you record at 10 in the morning, because you're used to playing, like I said, 10, 11 at night on your own dime with your own producer. So it pushed us a lot. We were working with what's called a click track. But what we found was the way the songs were sounding were perhaps different than we envisioned them, as these little 7 inches that we'd get from England, but the sound was bigger. We were capable of more sonically than sounding like the little band that could. Like the band that recorded Sunny Pie recorded it on I think an 8-track with like drums that had tape on them and a bass played through an effect. The White Room gave us the ability to have sounds that were like Pink Floyd and stuff. So that's where songs like Feigned Sleep became epic and huge.
Yeah.
And that's where we actually did Boyfriend as a demo to prove to the label that we could work in this big rock studio. And the Boyfriend that you hear on the record was actually recorded right when we first got a record deal. That was a demo, and it wound up being like the biggest thing on the record. And we were also very influenced by how on the My Bloody Valentine record, Loveless, there were little sounds in between, little kind of not quite songs, little tracks. And so we had these songs lined up that we'd never properly recorded. And in fact, a song that was on the daily, so right now on Spotify and Apple Music as part of the Fan EP, there are these 2 songs called Grow and Purr. They were recorded with the drummer of your dad's, or with a guitar player for your dad's old band, Angry Red Planet, in a punk rock studio. And these were punk rock guys who said, hey, this band is cool. They don't sound like anybody. Let's see if we can record them like a kind of hard, raw post-punk band. So when we got in the White Room, we had these more aggressive songs because we'd written more and bigger songs. We'd played live a lot. And so what we wound up doing was having these deep, really like well orchestrated, arranged versions of these songs that we'd always played live, but it was just like 3 guys and a singer. Now we had access to a Leslie organ, which you hear on Boyfriend. And we had all kinds of overdub capability. And that's what you hear on the Cicciolina. The Cicciolina on Love 15 is a world light years ahead of the one that's on the Fan EP.
Okay.
And all those songs like Grow was like, that was just a monstrous live song we had that we always used to play too fast, and kind of in the White Room really made us work it into a much better song. And then we had that song Brand, which is very much like Dave talking about like the cycle of, my favorite brand, like he's always drinking, he's always doing something. And it kind of captures that. And that's the thing about Love 15 is Love 15 was basically a lot of songs that we played live, but we never had a decent recording of. We had a chance to do a great recording at the White Room. And then the thing was, we did the songs at the White Room. And then we decided when we had some of like the Cicciolina and Horse, like the songs that in the White Room turned into like Pink Floyd epics. We still had some stuff we wanted to do, like the Penny for Love was to me phenomenal sounding. It's big. It's just a great song with a really great recording of it. And we wound up going back to the Temper Mill in Ferndale and recorded some of the songs with Dave Feeney, the ones that we felt the White Room was good for the songs like Cicciolina and Horse and Boyfriend. And then we went back to Dave Feeney at the Temper Mill to do other songs that we felt we wanted to just record live and that maybe didn't need all this extra instrumentation and production. So that's how Love 15 came around. We finished this record. We go to New York to promote it in the spring, and it comes out in the fall. And 1 month into it coming out, like we have a record release party, we have a tour booked. We even have the songs on the radio, Boyfriend. It's playing on college music stations.
Yeah.
The label Dolly Chameleon goes out of business.
Man.
Their angel investor was one of the Hyatt hotel guys named Dan Pritzker. He had a band called Neo Dada. He decided, pull the plug on it. I don't want to do this anymore. Wow. And our label mates on Dolly Chameleon were Caius, who now are called Queens of the Stone Age, and Lucinda Williams, who's one of the most famous alt country artists in the world. Those were our label mates. Like we were going to their shows. They weren't coming to ours, but you know what I mean? That's how we knew these people.
I really want to, because it's really interesting. So were there like any signs that like you knew that this was coming, like the company wanted to go, out of business or whatever? I mean, like
It's
were you
dark. It's a dark chapter because we had a friend at Electra Publicity named Shelby Mead. She was kind of our inside person. She's a famous publicist, like super famous. She's like Kelly Slater's publicist. She's phenomenal. She was like
okay.
Eric B. and Rakim's publicist. But back then she worked for Electra and she was kind of our inside person. And we were like, kind of like, what's the deal? Like, are we going to get picked up? And she's kind of like Caius was going to get picked up. The rest
Okay.
of the bands, almost nobody got picked up. I mean, even Lucinda Williams had to go find another label.
Yeah.
So we kind of had an inside track that we weren't going to be carried along. We weren't going to be absorbed by Elektra because the label we were on was a subsidiary of Elektra.
Okay.
So it was just one of those things where and it's perfect for our story. I remember being in New York to play a gig and actually going to the offices and being given boxes of our CDs and posters, all our promotional stuff, because it was just going to go into a warehouse. We
Yeah.
even got our master tapes. Like they were like, yeah, this place is going to be empty in 3 weeks. You might as well
Wow.
just take everything you can carry. And
Wow.
Dave and I like had all that stuff. And that was kind of the deal, you
Yeah.
know? And
Well,
that's, and it kind of became like, we got to get back to the wood. We got to go back to square one. And
yeah.
so we go back to Detroit, and that spring of 1994, we start writing harder, more aggressive songs. And that's where we get Sane. And
Yep.
that's where we get If JFA Were Still Together, which If JFA Were Still Together is kind of a metaphor for like if Majesty Crush was still signed to a major label. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like it was kind of bittersweet. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, If JFA Were Still Together is probably our most dynamic song in terms of starting off really aggressive and ending really beautifully and wistfully, like what could
Yeah.
have been, what could have been, you know? And
Okay.
Sane is probably Dave's best vocal in the world. It's about a woman who sacrifices her acting career to have a child, and she goes insane and kills herself, tries to kill her own kid. And you find out at the end of the song that the singer is in fact the surviving child of that mother. It's like the heaviest, coolest song. Like if
Yeah.
you listen to it,
Yeah. I
and
still need
that's
to.
where we wound up.
Yeah. I still need to finish listening to that. Because it's on YouTube, but the songs are kind of you have to find them. But okay, so yeah, so Love 15, and then so 94. So right when it comes out, you said you left the band. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah,
Kind
yeah.
of
I
what?
mean, I think the issue was we'd done the Sans Muscles EP, and that was kind of our last gasp. We financed it ourselves.
Yeah.
It came out, and we, did our regional gigs. We drove around, and we had a great time doing them. And by that fall, um, it just seemed like nobody's head was really in the band. Everybody was doing different stuff. I think we were all depressed,
Yeah.
and Dave started playing more guitar, and I had just decided it was time to leave. It
Yeah.
was the kind of thing where, um, it had been such a huge part of our lives. It was hard to go back to it being this kind of part-time thing. And I kind of had felt like for me personally, I'd done everything I wanted to do with that band.
Hmm.
And Dave was very clearly wanting to become a solo artist, which made all the sense in the world to me. And it's ironic because once the band broke up, I wound up playing in PSI, and we made a lot of songs that we recorded those songs at the White Room 2, and they wound up on that record, Heart of Stone. It's on Spotify right now under the name PS I Love You. But it was just one of these things that had run its course. And we were kind of a band where it was like, I remember we did one gig after the record company folded. We hadn't put out Sans Muscles yet because that came out right as I left the band. That's why it's called Sans Muscles, without muscles. I had left the band. My nickname was Muscles. And I remember we had a gig booked at St. Andrews Hall, us headlining. And there were about 2 or 3 other gigs in town that night. One place at something was at the Majestic, something big was at State Theater. And we're like, might as well do the gig. I mean, we're not, the big local band anymore. We're back to being the band that could and didn't.
Yeah.
And we show up and there's like 500 people there.
Yeah.
And for some reason that night it was the thing to do in Detroit.
Yeah.
And I think that was like our last great gig where it was like, wow, we built something that whether we're on a label or not, people still like this band. They'll show up to see it. And 500 people chose to see Majesty Crush that night. And it was a great night. And, I would say that was probably our last great gig. We did a few other ones, but they just started to get, Dave changed the words to Pennies for Love to Amsterdam because he wanted to call it, what was it called? Something Friends. Windmill Friends. It was called Windmill. And there were songs Dave didn't want to sing the lyrics to. And I just think he was going through a lot. His parents and he had invested everything into this band making it. And then suddenly we're back to square one. So there's a lot of frustration and there was a lot of, just we didn't know quite what we were going to do.
Yeah. I know we're almost out of time here, but I do kind of want to jump forward. So, the band 95, that's the end of Majesty Crush. And you guys kind of all do your own thing. But then Dave died in 2017, I believe that was the year. But then I want you to touch on a little bit of how the song Number One Fan made it onto the Southeast of Saturn comp, because that was my first exposure to the band.
That's a great story.
Yeah, hearing that comp.
Here's the miracle story. Okay, this is a crazy story, and it's a very, very good story. So this all happens in a 72-hour period, by the way. First thing that happens is Dave has passed. We're all in shock. And within a year, Dave's sister comes forth and says, I want to write Third Man Records and ask that they put out Dave's music because that's the thing Dave wanted to do. If anything ever happened to me, he wrote this in a note to his sister. I want my music to be heard. So she is going to send a message to Third Man Records. My friend, Dennis White, who records under the name Latroit, approaches me and says, do you guys own your music? Do you have your music? You should, if you put that out, it's the kind of music that could be in like music and film and stuff, or be in like films and TV and stuff. We call that sync rights. And I'm like, that's a great idea. I don't know. He's like, do you have your master tapes? And I'm like, I don't know. I checked my Facebook messages and there's a message from a lady in Wisconsin. And she says, I think I have your master tapes. And she has a picture, and it's the master tapes that Dave and I mastered in Wisconsin with Butch Vig's drum tech, a guy named Mr. Colson. So the masters of Love 15 have somehow come into this woman's possession. Well, it turns out Dave had a roommate in LA, and he left the masters in his closet. And then Dave proceeded to go off and had his mental health issues and then was killed. Well, it seems this guy passed away too. So all his stuff got sent to next of kin. Amongst the stuff sent were these master tapes.
Okay.
This is all in a 72-hour period. Dave's sister wants to talk to Third Man. I have a guy in my ear, Dennis White, saying, if you can get your music out, people are going to listen to it. And I find out we now have access to our master tapes. That Monday, we get approached by a guy that says, Third Man wants to do a compilation and they want me to help you out with it. What do you say we put Number One Fan on it? Do you happen to have the master tapes? So this all happens like in a very short amount of time. All these random things. Yeah. And suddenly we have the master tapes. Third Man wants to put out a song. Everything lines up. And it gets even crazier. But War and Fever, you know, the big thing is our tapes are so old. They're over 30 years old. They are on what's called a 2-inch machine, which was the industry standard and is no longer. So the whole thing is, well, who can master it with a 2-inch tape? It turns out Third Man Records opens a mastering department that has a 2-inch tape machine, and Warren DeFever, who is in the band His Name Is Alive, who we used to do early gigs with. In fact,
Yep.
the video's on YouTube of that gig. He's the mastering engineer. So it all comes together perfectly, like bizarrely, perfectly. We find out we have the masters. They get remastered. Number One Fan makes it on Third Man Records, just like Dave's sister Stephanie was going to ask them to.
Wow.
So that's how that happened. I know, it's crazy. It's the craziest story, and it totally showed that it was kismet. It was supposed to happen. So the Numero Group out of Chicago is the premier reissue label in these here United States. They win Grammy Awards for their packaging. Now, they're in their 25th year, or I think 30th year, something like that. But the point is, when they started, they were re-releasing funk and soul and obscure jazz compilations. They would like go into a town and post up at like a motel, and then they go around to like churches and community centers and say, hey, does your grandparents or your uncles or anybody own Little 45 records, or were they in bands? Did they ever record? And they would reissue these regional compilations of all these bands. So a lot of them, I wrote about one in 2008 called Downriver Revival, which was all about a Ford factory worker who set up a recording studio in his basement to record gospel and secular music, and actually had a hit in England in the 60s with what was called Northern Soul, which was like in England, they only liked obscure American soul music, not the Motown, the obscure stuff. So I wrote about and became familiar with the label. And we had a really good mutual friend, the owner, Rob. I had a friend out here named Daniel who was really tight with him. So Daniel made Rob aware of my band. So cut to 30 years later, they're putting out compilations of obscure music. Well, they've kind of exhausted all the funk and soul from what would be now almost 60 years ago. But now they're putting out groups from the 90s, like Codeine is one of the groups they put out. They put out a band called Rex. And the Numero Group, Rob, just said, hey, you know, there's this group out of Detroit. They were, how do I put it? They were like a pop shoegaze band that had a very charismatic singer who passed away tragically. They had a record that came out and then promptly disappeared. This is the perfect story for a perfect reissue. So they started to get in touch with us. And the next thing we know, we've got a record deal with them, and they're putting out Love 15. They're putting out the EPs. It's all going to come out on a big double vinyl thing. And then they're telling us they're just going to keep reissuing stuff. So they'll eventually put the Fan EP out on vinyl. They'll put the Sans Muscles EP out on vinyl. And it's great. We're totally happy about it. Yeah. So that's the story there. It's somebody I was made aware of back in like 2006, 2008, passing acquaintance. And then, you know, almost, 20 years later, it's like, hey, by the way, we're thinking about putting out your band now. So that's how that story goes. And it's great because, as you know, Majesty Crush has a lot of stories. Dave's tragic passing is only one of them. But as I've explained to you, there's all kinds of, kind of fables and happenstance and, false starts and stuff. So it makes for a really good story, And that's the thing. Majesty Crush is one of those bands, like the people who like it really, really like it. You know what I mean? And now we get a chance to put it out properly for people that are really interested in the music, and they're really going to be able to hear about it. And the irony was, because Left 15 never really got a proper shot, we're actually going to get a bigger distribution now than we ever would have back then. So it's pretty cool, because that's kind of in a weird zone. Those were kind of end of shift.
Okay.
Majesty Crush songs that Dave repackaged them as P.S. I Love You. P.S. I Love You is actually out on a label out of England called Rocket Girl that you can still buy Dave's music on there. But everything that's Majesty Crush related that basically Dave Odell, Michael, and I recorded is fair game. And I
Okay.
know we have the two singles, the Sunny
Yep.
Pie single and the Davies 7-inch we recorded with Tim Pack
Yep.
in 1991. And then there's the Love 15 album, which we have
Yep.
the masters for. And then there's the Sans Muscles EP that came out after I left. That for sure will be in some
Sweet.
way or the other addressed. And then we have some live recordings. We're not sure what's going to make it yet, what the
Okay.
time limitations are, two singles. But the way they work is they put out the compilation and then they start re-releasing the actual albums. So that's
Right.
what's kind of cool. You know, you'll have
Yeah.
the opportunity at some point to own these stuff in the vinyl format, even though it never came out that way in the first place. So it's pretty, that's what we're really excited about.